This is a lecture on Chapter 2, and we'll be looking at guidelines and reference points around nutrition. Let's start with the Dietary Guidelines. These are issued every 5 years from our government, but they're not created by the government. The government pulls together an expert committee to review the recent science. This committee issues a huge committee report, and then that is whittled down to the guidelines. There is industry influence in terms of the final guidelines that are issued, so we can't forget that. Some of the language might be softened. For instance, the committee believed that we should recommend that red meats are limited in the diet, and of course sugar-sweetened beverages, but the language didn't make that entirely clear. So industry does have an impact on these guidelines. Now, the other government-issued standard is the graphic. This started with the food pyramid in 1992, and this picture is supposed to tell 1,000 words about what type of diet would keep us healthy. So this was the old food pyramid, which Americans did not follow for a number of reasons. One of the many reasons that Americans were not following the food pyramid had to do with what the food industry was serving us. So the food industry increased portions tremendously. And what we know about portions is the more we get, the more we eat. So when people are served more, they eat more. There have been countless studies to show this. These studies come out of Cornell's Food and Brand Lab. We eat more, and that more means more calories. So when you look at the old-fashioned portion compared to the new portion, that might mean several hundred more calories. And that we know influences our health. So portion size came into play and probably was more influential than that food pyramid. One of the questions you might ask yourself is, what do we do about that? And that's up for debate. Should government be involved in things like taxing foods that are unhealthy and things like limiting the portion size? There's no right or wrong answer for sure, but we do know that when we do apply some policy here, there is a tendency to see change in food behaviors. So places that have added a significant tax to things like cigarettes or sweetened drinks do see a change in behaviors around those substances. Now, looking at this environment where we have these huge portion sizes, this now becomes part of what we must educate consumers to think about. And one of the ways to do this is through some common food items. I really like the golf ball. If you hold a golf ball in your hand, that's about the size that a portion of dried fruit or nuts or trail mix should be. A deck of cards is the old standard for 3 ounces of meat. A racquetball for a serving of ice cream. So it puts things into perspective when you have these common portions. Now in 2005, the pyramid changed a great deal to this, the MyPyramid, which was a mess. Most people didn't like it, but in its defense, it linked up to a very nice website at the USDA. And finally, we have the change to the MyPlate. The MyPlate was a welcome and heralded change. This is what you'll learn about in your textbook and through your homework as well. A lot of messages here, one being half your plate should be fruit and vegetable. You see that a smaller portion for the protein food, more for the plant foods. Now, I'm not going to go over this in detail because you'll be able to read all about the MyPlate system in your textbook, and you should. Understand the different food groups, understand the amounts that would be involved in a 2,000 calorie diet. So that's what you're seeing right up here. Commit those to memory for the test. Know what empty calories are. Empty calories is something that's covered in the textbook. Empty calories are the calories that are empty of nutrients. Okay, so sometimes people get confused and say water has empty calories. No, water has no calories. Something like a spoonful of sugar or 6 in your iced tea is empty calories, calories without nutrients. We also find empty calories in foods that have some value as well as the empty calories. There are other dietary guidelines that I really like, as a matter of fact. We talked about Michael Pollan. He says that dietitians make nutrition too confusing, and that what consumers need to know is that we should eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Keep in mind, though, he's talking about food and not edible food like substances. I love Marion Nestle's advice or guidelines. She says, eat less, move more. Eat fruit, vegetables, and whole grains, and avoid too much junk food. So kind of very simple, but easy to understand. Now in your homework, you'll be looking at an alternative to the MyPlate, and this is the healthy eating plate that comes out of Harvard. So the question asked requires you to do some research, to look online at a website I include. So I'm not going to give it away, but I will say this is a very different plate, and it comes from a different place because Harvard School of Public Health nutrition source is not influenced by industry. There's another system called, used to be the exchange list, now the choice list. This was begun for people with diabetes because it controls the carbohydrate, protein, and fat, but the carbohydrate, most importantly, to match up to the medication, especially insulin. It's probably used a little less now because more and more people have insulin pumps, other devices, and they are more likely to count carbohydrates than use the choice system. But it is a different system than our typical MyPlate exchange lists or MyPlate food group system. In this system, you'll find something like a potato in with the starch, in with the bread and the pasta, because potatoes look more like pasta or bread in terms of carbohydrate, protein, and fat than they look like a half a cup of green beans, for instance. We'll be talking about our food environment later, and we need to do a few more things. One is to look at the dietary reference intake. Now again, I'm just highlighting some areas. These are all very important for you to understand. This one in particular because you will be using it in your homework assignments. So the dietary reference intake are a number of different references that are used to make recommendations about nutrition. There are quite a few of them. We will use mostly 3. The RDA, which are your recommendations. How much iron do I need? How much protein do I need? The UL, which is the amount that can become toxic or be too much. Where can sodium cause a problem? Where can iron cause a problem? And the AMDR, which are the distribution or proportions of calories provided by carb, protein, and fat. So when we talk about the RDA and UL, it is informational to understand how they're set. The RDA is set at the high end of the needs for a lot of people. So when you study the daily nutrient requirement for nutrient X, you find a bell-shaped curve, and we set the RDA at the high end of that. Covers the needs of almost everyone. The UL is set much higher than the RDA, but again at the point where a toxicity becomes a concern. You can exceed the RDA and just be fine as can be until you reach the UL. So there's no problem with exceeding the RDA unless you reach the UL. And there's a good bit of kind of a cushion there. As far as the AMDR, again, they're the proportions that come from protein, fat, and carbohydrate calories, and keep in mind their ranges. So they're meant to allow wiggle room or preferences. Some people feel better with more protein and fat, less carbohydrate in their diet. Some people feel much better with more carbohydrate. So this does allow some wiggle room. We'll look at food labels in this chapter, and absolutely you must understand the information on food labels. I'll highlight a couple of things here. The ingredients are listed from most to least for weight. Daily values show you what your budget is for an entire day if you consume 2,000 calories, and percent daily values show you what percent of that budget you used up. If the percent daily value for that serving of food is less than 5%, that is low in a nutrient. Greater than 20% is high in a nutrient. And all of these numbers refer to the serving size. So if you're not eating a single serve package, but you're eating more than one serving by this size, then you have to do some math. So again, know what the ingredient list means, the percent daily value. Take a read through these slides carefully. This is the new food label, which is showing up on shelves as we speak. Calories take a bigger place. The servings have been adjusted to be more typical, and there are new vitamins and minerals which are required to be listed. These were chosen because they are considered to be most often an issue in diets in American individuals. Video bites, listen to them. They really do help with the information. Let's look at some food labels. Is this juice? Not really. If you read the ingredients, it's mostly water with sugar, sugar, and sugar. It's sugar water. Is there a big deal between non-fat milk and whole milk? Well, yeah, by calories, by fat, and especially by saturated fat. In a cup of whole milk, you're using up 25% of your budget for saturated fat. Do supplements have labels? They do. The tricky thing about supplements is no one's checking to make sure that the labels are accurate. So supplements are regulated loosely, very differently, and we'll talk about that later. On the other hand, if you see the seal, that shows that someone is checking, the USP. And finally, let's take a quick peek at what a nutritional assessment is. This is something actually you'll be doing through your Nutrition Applied homework. And it's something I love to do as a practitioner. Nutrition assessment is gathering data so you can make an assessment, a judgment about an individual's nutritional status or state. Okay, so you do start with collecting information about food behaviors. You're keeping a 3-day record that's sometimes used, a journal of sorts, sometimes food frequency questionnaires, but we gather information about typical food behaviors, typical food choices made over the course of a day or more. And then that is entered into something like iProfile, which can compare, at least over those days, how your intake compares to your recommendation. So under 75% is falling short. For some things, that would be a good thing. If you're falling short in sodium or saturated fat, since the 100% is actually a limit, that is not a bad thing. But 54% of iron could be a problem. You're not even, or you're just barely meeting half of your iron needs. We also collect measurements. They're called anthropometric measurements, things like height and weight and mid-arm circumference. We'll collect information on medical history, a physical exam, and laboratory measurements as well. We'll talk a lot about them in this class. We ask questions about family patterns, family health, because we're trying to get at the influence of genetics as well, because that becomes important in our plan for the individual. Wanted to point out one more thing that's really, really important. You're keeping a 3-day record. Okay, it is only a 3-day record. So we cannot diagnose a deficiency from a 3-day record. In fact, we cannot diagnose a deficiency from food intake data alone. It can give us a clue, it can raise a red flag, but for a number of reasons, one being perhaps those days don't represent your intake over a longer period. Another being, it takes a while for a deficiency to develop, as you can see here. And lastly being, we need other pieces of the puzzle. I might see that this individual has a low iron intake, but I'm going to want to see some blood values as well. And I'm also going to want to ask that person about how they're feeling and do a physical exam, look at things like nail beds and the color of maybe the lining of the eye, etc. So an assessment uses multiple pieces to put together this puzzle. Now remember, after this, you need to read Chapter 2 and work through the Chapter 2 assignments in your Unit 1 module.